Siegel would like to welcome you to today's webinar presentation, Planning a Successful Funding Policy. Now I would like to introduce our speakers. First, we have Kathy Eidelberg. She's our National Director of our Public Sector Market. We have Paul Angelo, Senior Vice President and Actuary, and Kim Nickel, who is also Senior Vice President and our National Public Sector Retirement Practice Leader. Now I will turn the call over to Kathy.
Thank you, Liza, and good afternoon or good morning, depending on what time zone you're in. We're very pleased that you've joined us today to talk about this important topic. To start out, what are the drivers of funding policy review? And of course, many of you know that the Government Accounting Standards Board has put out new accounting and expense rules. They don't drive the funding policy, but they do have some impact. And one of the outcomes of the new GASB rule is for people to kind of think about the funding policies that they have. And also, the largest drivers are the demographic and economic changes that we're seeing in general. Of course, we've had the Great Recession. We don't need to really go into the impact on retirement systems, but clearly it had a large impact. And although states are starting to improve their fiscal conditions, there have been structural changes to governments that are not going to change anytime soon, such as smaller workforces or performing fewer services. So the retirement systems need to reflect the new normal. And although we know that over 40 states actually, have made changes in the design to their retirement systems, which will help reduce future liabilities, there's still an issue of the legacy retirement systems and providing a proper funding, prudent funding policy for these plans that are now in place. We know that there are national organizations around the country that have been looking at the issue of funding policies, organizations that represent the management side in the public sector, such as the governors, the state legislators, the cities and the counties, and also retirement systems, National Association of State Retirement Association, National Council on Teacher Retirement, and the Government Finance Officers Association. All of these groups are working to set up funding guidelines, so the broad parameters of what makes for a strong funding policy. Also, the public sector actuaries that are in the Conference of Consulting Actuaries are working on putting the technical teeth to those funding guidelines that the national organizations are developing. So today, what are we going to look at in our session? We're going to be looking at a renewed focus on funding policy, the general policy objectives. What are the things that you really need to look at and work through to get for your plan the right answer on funding? The components of a funding policy, and then we'll move to all of you that are out there to try to answer specific questions. And I am going to turn it over to Kim Nickel.
Thank you, Kathy. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. I want to start with talking about the renewed focus on funding policy. Why are we talking about funding policy today, since most governmental plans have been in existence for decades? And so we're going to go into why we're talking about funding policy. But first off, it really does start with the governance issue. The funding policy should be based upon an actuarially based contribution amount. And the funding policy does include actuarial assumptions as well as the components of funding policy. It's important to note that if you don't have a contribution that's based on an actuarially based funding policy, if you're not going to contribute that amount, then really doesn't really matter what your funding policy is. It's important, we believe, to have a contribution amount that's legally enforceable. It is a legally enforceable demand on the employer, and that the funding policy ought to be based upon actuarially based contribution requirements.